So we're going to keep this short and sweet. This discussion is basically following on from the last few days, the objective of which was to figure out how to work together to achieve our common goal of reversing biodiversity loss and implementing the National Biodiversity Action Plan. So I'm going to ask Andrew, Ella and Jane to summarise the different 3 themes that were across the 2 days. They were engagement, planning for the future and investing in nature. So I think firstly for engagement, we have Ella summarising.
Yeah, I thought Andrew was going to go first.
Oh, sorry.
No, Joe. So I was at the engagement sessions, and there were 6 different things: communities, farmers, youth, business, conservation, and citizen science. I mean, if I was to have a kind of digested read of all of them, it would kind of be funding, and translating what's happening on the ground. So the fact that there's a lot of bottom-up action, but translating that then politically in terms of government policy, that being an issue. So communities, funding is a big issue. It's hard to get, hard to apply for, and hard to keep going. And there seemed to be a sense of an attachment between communities and government. The idea that what happens on the ground has to feed upwards. A need to focus on what's going on in Ireland and not globally. And also the sense that the way that you engage people with certain issues is to connect with what affects them directly. And an example was given about flooding, that's one way of engaging people with what their local river and what happens to it. The farming session looked at the farmer-centred approach from the Burren Life Project, the idea that we should change how farmers see the land, the conflict between environmental policy and farm policy, which was really interesting. So farmers themselves being sort of split between 2 different silos. And also not to assume that farmers actually know about biodiversity because they're not taught it in their own education, in the Green Cert and all the rest. Young people's session was really engaging and interesting. The young gentleman from school, whose name was, I can't quite remember, but he was very good and said that, there needs to be some sort of youth body to translate the actions that they're doing into politics. The idea that nature needs to be curriculum-based. Teaching the teachers to make change, and also the importance of farmers' children to be involved in the conversation. Quickly getting on to business, they spoke about the natural capital approach and working with Origin Green, business being under pressure from shareholders who are asking about biodiversity, and non-financial reporting. They're employing a scientist in Dublin Port, so the idea that you actually use that kind of expertise in your own strategy. And the importance of integrating biodiversity into all aspects of social responsibility. Conservation, the requirement for biodiversity officers, trained ecologists. The question about whether the pollinator plan could be under severe threat and could disappear without funding. The importance of bottom-up action is, again, that theme. More funding. Using prizes to celebrate and encourage people. Planning laws to integrate the pollinator plan, and also the importance of implementing the National Biodiversity Plan. So the sense that we don't actually really need to talk anymore about this. The laws just need to be implemented and enforced. And finally, citizen science. I'll be quick here. So painted a really interesting picture of really significant volunteering of citizens in the national interest in terms of collecting science. Good example across various different areas: bats, whales, and dolphins. A real need for a biodiversity citizen science strategy for Ireland, to create a sense of ownership, the idea that citizen science isn't free, but we need to keep schemes going, and the importance also of the next generation, so training, schools, and all the rest. More money needed, and the importance of giving feedback to the people who are undertaking this citizen science projects themselves, and to give them a sense of their own value. And that is it.
Thank you, Ella.
You're welcome.
Andrew, on the planning for the future theme, could you sum up from the last 2 days?
Sure. So, planning for the future, we had 6 parallel sessions, like everyone else. We had 2 on climate change, 2 on agriculture, 2 on river catchments. We heard about some great projects: Nor Vision, Kerry Life, Ponds for Farm Biodiversity, McGillicuddy Reeks Forum. And what I have here is rather than trying to summarise everything that happened in all the sessions. I have to thank Raoul, who was the rapporteur in this theme, for a couple of messages from each, and then I have some sort of general thoughts on planning for the future that occurred across the sessions. So the two climate change sessions, there was an emphasis on habitat loss and fragmentation, plus climate change as drivers of biodiversity loss, with the drivers varying depending on the ecosystem and biome. I've been immersed in climate science for the last year or so due to my involvement in Climate Case Ireland. And one really shocking conclusion that jumps out to me in this area is the statement in the IPCC's recent special report on 1.5 degrees. 70 to 90% of coral reefs will be lost at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, and more than 99% lost at 2 degrees Celsius, which really shocked me. Funding was also very much to the fore in more than one session. Funding to fill knowledge gaps, need for dedicated funding that would continue and so on, support projects beyond their otherwise natural life. We had an excellent consultation exercise in the climate area on the sectoral adaptation plan for biodiversity. River catchments, we heard aquatic biodiversity is declining faster than on land, with agriculture, wastewater, hydromorphology and forestry amongst the drivers. And there was an emphasis in this session and in others on the potential for citizen science to be very important in this area. Agriculture and biodiversity, so we heard things getting worse, not better. Agri-environment schemes have yet to show significant value for biodiversity. We talked, of course, about the importance of the forthcoming CAP reform process, the need for targeted outcome-oriented actions, need for credible and transparent monitoring systems, and so on. And the thing that really jumped out at me, and I'd return to this maybe at the very end, was, and this is no criticism at all of the session, but it seems to me that the agriculture and biodiversity discussion is the same now as it has been for the last maybe 20 years in terms of CAP reform. It's the same discussion, and the CAP reform never really seems to deliver for biodiversity. I'll come back to that at the end. So 3 general thoughts then in terms of planning for the future. It seems to me we're great at making plans for the future, if not implementing them. And that was said by various people, amongst them Yvonne, in the context of the National Biodiversity Action Plan. I blitzed a list of plans in this area relevant to biodiversity, listening to all the sessions. I would note down the plans, and then I added a few more of my own. This is by no means comprehensive, but my God, are we good at making plans. These are all plans that are active now and into the future with different start dates and finish dates. But I won't give you the dates, but we have, for example, and I'll have to take a deep breath for this, I think, the National Biodiversity Action Plan with some local plans under that, Project Ireland 2040 with the National Planning Framework, the National Development Plan. We have the National Mitigation Plan in the context of climate change, National Adaptation Framework with the sectoral adaptation plans under that. We have River Basin Management Plan, we have the National Raised Bog SAC Management Plan, we have the National Implementation Plan for the SDGs, we have the Prioritised Action Framework for Natura 2000, we have Foodwise 2025 and its implementation plan, we have the Forestry Programme, we have the National Strategic Plan for Sustainable Aquaculture Development, we have the Nitrates Action Programme, we have the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, we have the Dublin City Invasive Alien Species Action Plan, the National Landscape Strategy, and so on and so forth. You could continue in this way. So when we're looking at planning for the future, it seems to me we don't and we can't start with a blank slate. That's very clear. We can try and come up with grand schemes, but to a certain extent we work with what we have. Some of these plans are as important, if not more important, than the National Biodiversity Action Plan. I'll come back to that in a second. Some of the plans will damage biodiversity and need to be challenged. I mean, the example here which is being challenged is the National Mitigation Plan, which is an oddly named plan because it doesn't plan for mitigation at all. It's a plan that covers 2017 to 2022, when the projections suggest that emissions will rise, not fall. So I'd suggest it's a misnamed plan. When you look at these plans, you have to ask yourself, have we missed the boat to change them? Legally, because once the window of challenge closes. When do they next come up for revision? Lots of those plans that I mentioned in my list, as it happens, are coming up to be revised quite soon, and that's obviously a good thing. We have a chance to feed into them. There are some new plans coming up, more climate plans, the National Energy and Climate Plan, this all of government climate plan that's coming forward, so there's an opportunity to change those. But one of the most important plans, I think, if I can find my page, which is less difficult to change now, is and Michael Ewing mentioned it a moment ago, Project Ireland 2040, so the National Planning Framework and the National Development Plan, the first of which runs to 2040, the second of which runs 2018 to 2027. And I think what we can learn from those is that not all plans are created equally. So we heard we just need to implement the National Biodiversity Action Plan. Some plans are designed legally for implementation and some aren't. And if you look at the National Planning Framework, this has been clearly thought through legally as a framework that ought to flow from the national level down to individual planning decisions on the ground. So you have the National Planning Framework, under which are these regional, spatial and economic strategies, then the development plans and then planning decisions. And I don't know, how many people here made submissions on the National Development Plan or the National Planning Framework or the regional, spatial and economic strategies? A few people. But the National Planning Framework plans for population growth of 1 million by 2040, plans for 500,000 new homes, 50% in cities and 50% spread across the country. We talk about habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. These regional, spatial and economic strategies are planning where all these houses are going to go. And the opportunity for consultation, the consultation window just closed. So what I wanted to say about that in the context of biodiversity is there's a real opportunity here to make a difference, because there are biodiversity objectives under the National Planning Framework. And when you follow the hierarchy, and this is why I say this is designed to be implemented, at each tier, the next plan has to be consistent with the one above. Mm-hmm. So it's up to all of us to go out there and say, the regional, spatial and economic strategy for my area is not consistent with the biodiversity objectives of the National Planning Framework. And similarly, the development plan that my local authority has made is not consistent with the regional, spatial and economic strategy. And that should flow down right to planning decisions on the ground. So there's an opportunity there. And I'm drawing to a close, I promise. Third general point, plans and policies, really, they're no substitute for robust, binding legal frameworks. And the Habitats and Birds directives at EU level, really, they came through time and time again. Michael OBrien talked about them, of course. We've heard people saying they ensure that they're implemented. I would add here, Michael O'Keeffe yesterday had 7 L's. I would add an 8th, which is don't be scared to litigate where necessary. And litigation has been a hugely important driver of biodiversity policy in Europe and Ireland. Our Natura 2000 sites, 604 of them, only 46 management plans available on the website, missing conservation objectives, missing site designations. 40 years after the Birds Directive is adopted, some sites still undesignated. The Commission's litigating to change that now. We heard about that. There's an opportunity for all of us to do that too. And I'll return just to close then on the point, sorry, where I said it seems to me that we're stuck in certain areas, that we're not making enough progress. There's a lot of talk of a just transition in the climate policy area, particularly in the energy sector, Bord na Móna and so on, a just transition for workers. And given the seriousness of the situation we're in, how about a just transition for those in positions of power? And this is if I had one idea for nature, this would be it. I'm stealing it from yesterday. Let's support and promote the next generation of young leaders, in particular young female leaders. It seems to me that men, and in particular, particularly middle-aged men, have had a good crack of the whip the last 300,000 years of human history. And and how about we give young people, young female leaders a chance? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. So the final theme, the third theme, was investing in nature, and Jane is going to sum up from that.
Okay, thank you. So I think what we've heard over the last couple of days is that there's some really good methods and metrics for valuing nature and illustrating the value of nature, and we're making progress here. But as both Ella and Andrew said, that we're looking for funding mechanisms. So we need to connect people with nature. We need to make them part of it, and emphasising the impact of biodiversity loss on their own lives and their own economies is important. But we've been hearing a lot about needing to include the importance of cultural values. It's not all about markets. We need to make arguments with hearts and minds. And actually, we're probably further down that line than we think. People do care, they are willing, but often the structures aren't there. So another thing that came up, particularly this afternoon, is what are people willing to pay for the radical changes that are needed for a new food system or a new energy system? Will people put their money where their mouths are? And in terms of investment, this could be via incentives and taxes, but where does the money come from for incentives, and where are the taxes applied are still key questions. So I think one of the big gaps is, how do we finance the delivery of ecosystem service benefits? So how do we invest in natural capital to extend and renew it? How do we release natural capital equity without eroding it? And I think there are options. We may not fully understand them yet. There are also gaps. One of the key things is that we need to upskill the workforce to access finance, and I think that's something that has come through from several of the sessions. Also, the role of corporates looking at their supply chains. There's a role for procurement. Thinking about, we've heard about expressions like from farm to fork and everywhere in between. There's potential for investment at every step through this supply chain, and companies can invest back into biodiversity. So I think that the last key point, I think, that's come out possibly from all of the sessions, is that it's about partnership and working together. That there can't just be investment from the government. We can't just expect investment from the government. We need to include corporates, and we need to find innovative funding mechanisms.
Thank you, Jen. And we'll go to John. What have you learned over the last 2 days?
Yeah, I suppose I might part the fact that I'm a middle-aged male, maybe just for this part of the conversation, but. So I work within government policy, mainly in terms of climate adaptation area, looking at climate resilience, and it's been very interesting. I suppose maybe first to say, I think over the 2 days, just to say that it's been a really, really amazing 2 days, and a really good idea that this has actually happened, and just to congratulate Ciaran and the team for putting on an amazing 2 days, because I think that's the first thing I would say. And I suppose, and hopefully the voice won't go, but what I found actually was an awful lot of similarities in terms of the journey that I suppose I've done on the policy side with climate, in terms of I suppose a lot of similarities, and just taking those three the theme areas. For example, several times over the couple of days, I've heard the expression, we need to talk, and we need a dialogue. And this is something that we've really found, I suppose, very necessary in the climate space as well. And it's not just, I suppose, the usual suspects. And maybe some people might say, when we have a conference like this, that we're in a room of the usual suspects. We're all on the same page to a large degree. But how do we actually get to the community level? How do we actually communicate to think, on what's important? And it's been said before, what people at the local community level actually value. And if I go to talk to people at the community level about climate change, it gets very I suppose abstract after a while. But if you're talking about maybe a local biodiversity issue, stuff that has an impact from climate, for example, then you have an opening conversation and a dialogue about what's I suppose valuable for that community. So that's something that we found, I suppose, I found very similar across what's happened on the climate side. On the planning side, again, I think a real as Andrew said, we do have a lot of plans, and we have a lot of policies, and I think there's there's no question, but we need to kind of coordinate an awful lot more. And I think kind of there is processes in place now where we're kind of trying to do that, to have that cross-sectoral or integrated approach. It probably isn't kind of showing kind of what that can do at this stage, but it is a difficult process, and I think but it is something I think kind of that from a planning point of view, again coming from the climate side, I suppose, but the climate and biodiversity side of things are kind of very much intertwined. So from that point of view, it's kind of it's trying to kind of how do we make sure that we kind of integrate better. That we don't have one policy interacting in a negative way on a different policy and kind of so forth. So policy coherence and coordination is key. And I'm struck in that sense by kind of what President Higgins said this morning. There was a couple of terms that he used. Common purpose was one. And I think this is something that we always kind of, I think, kind of need to think about when we're talking about issues like climate change and biodiversity. The right thing to do. Kind of it's, not overthinking it, kind of in terms of what it is. Changing the mindset, and I suppose the last one was kind of imagining our futures. So what does it look like? What does a new future look like for all of us in terms of climate and what that means for biodiversity, kind of not just at the local level but at the national level. In terms of investing, kind of I think it's obvious that there's there is a need on the financial side to kind of look at different kind of needs that are out there. But I just kind of what I picked up over the 2 days was really a need to invest in data and actually kind of managing data and getting access to data and actually kind of coordinating better on the data sets that we do have. And how do we do that kind of benefits I suppose sort of not just the biodiversity side but the climate side as well. So that's kind of really important. And I suppose maybe 3 things that just kind of final comments that I would make is that I suppose, or maybe 2, is that I suppose this conference now has kind of been, it's the first of its kind, I suppose kind of in terms of being a national conference. So kind of biodiversity has kind of hit a career high over these 2 days. And it's critical, I think, that the next steps kind of are going to be really important, kind of how this is followed up in terms of what happens next. And we found that very much on the climate side as well. And just to finally say, I think we need to start thinking a lot more maybe in the positive space in terms of opportunities and kind of how we work together and maybe less on kind of, while there is plenty of scope to talk about doom and gloom, I think there's also kind of like an awful lot of scope that helps, I think, kind of activities and for people to kind of work together is that we look at the positive side of things in terms of how that might happen.
Brilliant. So, thank you, John. So it's been a very inspiring couple of days and there's a real energy around it. And a lot of people have said it's been fantastic, really energizing. Thank you to all of the organisers for doing such an amazing job. But then people have been saying, okay, so what next? The team have said, we've got the Slido, there's an opportunity to put questions. All of this is being captured, everything from the whole 2 days. So please do put your feedback in and answer the feedback form afterwards as to what you would like to see next. A conference like this, would you like it again? Would you like regional? What are the priorities, etc.? So the next Slido poll I have for this session is, what's your seed for nature? What are you going to do individually going away? What action are you going to take away and commit to today? And I'm going to put that to each of the panel. And I know that we're having the announcement around Seed for Natures after this as well. So this is about us individually, how we're going to help contribute to it. So we're walking away with action, not just on a high that's going to go down. So I'll start with Ella.
After seeing Michael Ewing's population graph, I am going to stop planting seeds and never get pregnant again. I'm going to stop mowing my lawn, but I will just say one thing professionally. I have a background in science and huge respect for scientists, but as a journalist, I really depend on independent science, verifiable science, and to that end, the National Biodiversity Data Centre provides people like me who work in journalism an amazing access to data. And I think that if they're not funded properly, long-term, and in a way that respects the staff that are there, but also leads to 40 staff working there, that, that would be a shame, to put it mildly. So I'll do everything I can personally to write to everyone I know to make that happen, because professionally it helps me so much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anna.
inspired by Alena Goff's excellent presentation on ponds for farm biodiversity. I'm going to create a pond in my garden, and I'm also going to litigate more for biodiversity. Sorry, government people in the audience.
Thanks, Andrew. Jane?
So as an ecologist, I want, my personal commitment is to continue to contribute to providing the ecological evidence base and working, of course, with the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, but also to work outside of my comfort zone, to work with other sectors, to work with other disciplines to try and achieve the mission of valuing, protecting and restoring nature.
Thanks, Jane.
Yeah, I suppose kind of one area that's come to my mind, I suppose that's been mentioned several times over the last couple of days that maybe hasn't got enough attention is the marine environment. And I suppose from my point of view, we've been trying to do a small bit of work on this and trying to kind of look at all the different stakeholders and the different government departments that have jurisdiction or don't. So I think kind of my commitment will be to kind of try and kind of, I suppose, kind of push that out in terms of kind of trying to do something along with our colleagues in the kind of on the biodiversity side to see if we can kind of develop much more coherence in that sector. Yeah.
Great. Brilliant.
What I would say is that this conference itself is a seed, and it's enabled us to get a reach into places that sometimes are hard to reach, reaching high up in the food chain. And what we need to do now is to nurture this and to bring the outcomes of this to our senior level management, to politicians, and also to nurture the fact that we had interest from a wide range of departments, which isn't always the case. So we'll work on this seed.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I should put myself on the spot as well, shouldn't I? And as I suppose a scientist and a practitioner, I tend to put my head down and just work, and I forget to communicate. And I think the last few days have been around communication, but also about that we've got different sectors here. So I'm going to commit to communicate more about what I'm doing as well. Yeah. And thank you everyone for submitting their commitments as well. So it's great that we've got that momentum moving forward. And so the panel discussion is over. I'd like to invite Yvonne up to summarise for us for the last 2 days.